Hi, this is Julie, and before we begin, I want to invite you, especially if you're a mom like me whose child has moved on to their next chapter, to subscribe to the podcast, join our Facebook group, and email me at julie@mothersquest.com to learn about our upcoming circle, virtual milestone hike, and all the other ways that Mother's Quest can support you. Consider this moment your window of opportunity to invest in yourself and reclaim your epic life. Now, on to the show. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neale, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to two high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? I'm honored to bring you this special part 2 with dyslexic author, speaker, and advocate Jonathan Mooney. This time, interviewed by my neurodivergent college freshman son, Ryan Neale. If you haven't yet listened to part 1 for a full exploration of Jonathan's epic life journey, I encourage you to go to that episode next. This episode, inspired by part 1, was Ryan's opportunity just before he left for college to ask Jonathan for wisdom and guidance about how to flourish at a university while being neurodivergent. What unfolded was that and so much more. Before I share more, I want to introduce my dear college friend, Cindy McCormick, who stepped into the role of college counselor, essay editor, and biggest cheerleader for Ryan during his college exploration and application process. Here's Cindy with this episode's dedication.
Hello, I'm Cindy McCormick, and I'm honored to dedicate this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast to my son, Garrett. Garrett, who is autistic, just began his freshman year of high school, a time of uncertainty not only for him, but also for me as his mom. Listening to this episode about neurodivergence and embracing non-normalcy, especially for high school students thinking about college, made me reflect on my own journey as Garrett's mom and as an educational consultant. Learning to parent a neurodiverse child has been a long road, and my experiences raising Garrett, plus my background in education, inspired me to start my own college advising business. While Garrett's 4 older brothers are not autistic, it was Garrett who opened my eyes to life outside the bell curve, so to speak. I have always tried to empower students to identify their own strengths and learning styles, just like Jonathan Mooney talks about in this episode when emphasizing self-understanding and finding the learning environment that matches one's abilities. Whether in a classroom or a college advising office, I love coaching high schoolers to do just that. Because high school can be fraught with anxiety, comparison, and self-doubt, especially when being real can feel risky. Being labeled neurodiverse in any form simply confirms a difference, when in fact, every human is uniquely different. When Julie, my friend since high school, asked if I could college advise her son Ryan, I was honored. And learning that he was autistic, had ADHD and anxiety, just confirmed my desire to work with him. What I have learned through preparing hundreds of students for college is that diverse is normal. When I understand my students for who they truly are, I earn their trust and their walls come down. Their vulnerable, beautiful souls emerge. And that safety and authenticity opens the door to finding the right fit college. I not only enjoy matching students' interests to universities, but I love helping them with their essays. Beyond the stress, college essays invite introspection. I have witnessed some profound student transformations through that writing process. But Ryan was a standout. He blossomed. I am so proud to have contributed to his journey, and I'm beyond inspired by his story. He's a champion for the neurodivergent community. And although I guided him on his path, he gave me powerful insights to connecting with the uniquely non-normal student, who coincidentally is every single one of them.
Thank you, Cindy, for your beautiful dedication to your own son, Garrett. Also, thank you for the incredible ways that you championed Ryan to use the power of writing his college essays to better understand himself and to step more fully into his authenticity. I will always remember how you worked with him in unique ways that tapped into his strengths. and the many moments when I would overhear you saying to him emphatically, Ryan, you did enough. You are enough. These themes of honoring ourselves, our enoughness just as we are, each of us unique individuals with differences, finding environments where we can thrive and making a contribution are woven so beautifully through this discussion. In this episode, I passed the microphone completely to Ryan, sat back and listened to him and Jonathan uncover how we can all learn and live outside the lines and stop faking normal. I invite you to listen to this conversation with the same sense of curiosity and trust. I hope you will arrive at the end as Ryan, Jonathan, and I all did, personally transformed by the experience. This is truly a special episode, and I am so honored to share it with you. I'm Julie Neale, and this is Mother's Quest. Jonathan, welcome back to the Mother's Quest podcast for this part 2. I'm so excited to have you here.
Yeah, I mean, no disrespect to part 1, but this is what I've been looking forward to the most. So thanks for having me back.
I'm going to pretty much pass it off to Ryan, who's going to lead this interview, and I'll come in with any questions or reflections that I have, but mostly I'll be listening and learning and look forward to closing out the three of us at the end. So Ryan, on to you.
All right. To listeners of the Mother's Quest podcast who aren't yet acquainted, my name is Ryan Neale, and I'm Julie's first and obviously best son. You may have heard me before in my bar mitzvah interview 5 years ago, way back when Mother's Quest was still in its infancy, and more recently, just about a year ago, where my mom and I interviewed the lovely and talented Julie Lythcott-Hames, former Stanford dean and author of How to Be an Adult. And it was that interview where we actually learned about Jonathan Mooney at the end of the interview, when where we were talking in detail about ideas of neurodiversity and normalcy. She strongly recommended to me that I read the book Normal Sucks by Jonathan Mooney. In fact, she sent me my copy. And as someone with ADHD and stimulation issues, I was like, okay, I'll do it. And then I obviously found myself on YouTube and Netflix more than reading books. But when I did get a chance to read it, the messages in the book and Jonathan's candor and introspectiveness and humor, talking about his experiences, specifically about how he found that rephrasing society's idea of normalcy rather than forcing neurodiverse individuals to have to change themselves, it really resonated with me. So from that point on, I've saw Jonathan as a role model, someone I definitely love to meet and talk to. So this interview's great opportunity, a dream come true, and I'm just so excited to get started.
Well, I'm super psyched to be a part of it. And that was a beautiful, articulate, and eloquent introduction, though I think you buried the lead, especially when we start talking about role models, is you are on your way and about to embark into college, if I'm not mistaken, UCLA. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So you are just a badass, my friend. I mean, why do you shy away from your badassness? Just lean right into it, man. I can't tell you how inspiring it is for me, and I can't tell you how inspiring it is for other moms, dads, neurodiverse learners, humans to hear about your success and the path that you've carved for yourself. It's really meaningful for everyone to hear that. So thank you for letting me be a little part of your journey today.
Thank you so much. It's hard to find a better word than thank you, but it really does mean a lot to hear. And I guess that's the point of the interview, I guess, if I'm to step into it, both of us being role models for, again, any parents of neurodiverse kids themselves, or, I mean, really anyone who relates at all to the idea of being not normal or not fitting a social norm. Just kind of, normal sucks. Let's get that word normal out of our brains and move forward. So with that, I want to start off, for anyone who isn't yet acquainted with Jonathan Mooney's story, hasn't read his books yet, keyword being yet. or hadn't listened to the part one interview, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your journey to college and the biggest obstacles you had to overcome, especially surrounding neurodiversity, just to kind of introduce everyone listening to your story.
Yeah, the journey to college was a gauntlet, as it was. And I still think, unfortunately, still is for folks who weren't outside the lines and live outside the lines. I graduated from Brown University. It was not what anyone predicted for me. I was the kid who spent a lot of the day chilling out with the janitor in the hallway because of my ADD. I was the kid who grew up on a first name basis with Shirley, the receptionist in the principal's office, because of my ADD. And I was a kid who spent a lot of the day, hiding in the bathroom so I didn't have to read out loud. I generally got the message from multiple sources that I was the stupid, crazy, lazy, defective learner. And I was told all sorts of negative things about my future. I'd never have a job. I'd be a high school dropout. I'd end up in jail. And, I transcended those low expectations as a result of a lot of support, help from teachers, my mom, folks who thought differently about folks who learned differently, and made it to college. So my biggest obstacle on that journey was obviously some of the systemic practices that marginalize and really exclude people who learn differently. Systemic practices like the reading groups, like the desk and the kid who can't sit still is the bad kid in the hallway. Those systemic practices were barriers. They were manifestations of institutionalized ableism where certain brains are privileged over others. And they held me back, and they hold others with atypical brains back all the time. I will say that beyond the systemic barriers, which are real, I think my biggest barrier to imagining that I had a place in higher education, but not just higher education, imagining that I had a positive future or something to contribute, ultimately, my biggest barrier were the internalized messages that I was stupid, crazy, lazy, that I was less than. And it was a lifetime journey to overcome those messages, which I really believed deeply about myself. And it wasn't about overcoming my learning differences or neurodiversities. It was about overcoming the way that I was taught to see myself because of those neurodiversities. And I still struggle with that today.
I can't really express enough how much and how numerous of the things you talked about I resonated with. For context, I'm ADD, I have anxiety, and I'm autistic. And dealing with the limitations in societal systems and the way I saw myself within those has been a constant barrier throughout my life. And it's nice to know that I'm not alone in that there are other neurodiverse people who feel similarly. Just off the bat, I love how you phrased the real obstacle to overcome isn't our own so-called deficits. It's the deficits of the systems, specifically educationally, as we're talking about, obviously going off to college, that the shortcomings of these systems that are really supposed to help people and they're not doing their job. And it didn't just resonate because of myself, but my younger brother, Jacob, who has ADHD and dyslexia. Even though our family has, in my view, done as good a job as possible reinforcing ideas that he is smart and capable and ready to be successful. And we've been incredibly privileged and fortunate to have invested in his education, allowing him to be in a school that supports dyslexic learning. He still constantly comments on how he's stupid and dumb and can't read. And it just shows how perceptive young kids, even as young as elementary school age, how perceptive they are to ideas of normalcy and smart versus stupid and what the education system presents these labels to be.
And I think your brother's journey shows how persistent those messages still are to this day. And specifically when it comes to the notion of who's smart and who's not in America, we more than ever, I think, really privilege a certain manifestation of intelligence. The smart kid is, the kid who reads. The smart kid is the kid who has nice handwriting or spells well. And then the smart kid ultimately is one who masters a set of academic skills that's very narrow. But the reality is, I'm sure you've seen this in your own life, Ryan, that some of the smartest people don't do school well. They don't read well, they don't write well, but they can sort of rebuild the car engine from scratch. And that person is just as intelligent, as the person with the 4.0, but that's not the message. We all know what gets you in the smart group, and it ain't your tactile kinesthetic intelligence. It's not your social emotional IQ. It's not whether you can build or draw or talk or care about other humans. It's a very narrow band of skills. And that message is deep, and it damages people's sense of self, and it derails their life. And so I think it's upon all of us to broaden our aperture and celebrate the multiple manifestations of human flourishing, and to really challenge and critique this singular notion of intelligence, when the reality is intelligence isn't one thing but many, because so many people are out there, thinking, hey, I'm dumb. And as it's true with your brother, and it's true with all human beings, nothing is further from the truth. We need to ask a new question about everybody in our life, not how smart are they, but how are they smart? And when we start asking that question, about our loved ones, when we start asking that question about ourselves, it opens up a whole new path towards thriving that's grounded in what's right with somebody, not what's wrong.
I love how you phrase that key question in terms of what is smart, because funnily enough, that actually segues quite nicely into the questions I had prepared for this interview, specifically around how to be neurodiverse in an academic environment and how to overcome these obstacles. And so much of that is based on the education system's ideas of what is smart. I love the story in the first chapters of Learning Outside the Lines, where it may have been in high school or college, I can't quite recall, but basically you were an A- student in your English classes, using all the resources available, typewriter, fax machine, your mother, spell and grammar check to be able to submit your assignments on time and well. But unfortunately, for your final exam, the school wasn't willing to grant necessary accommodations for spelling and grammar for you to be able to do that. And as a result, as it says in the book, you actually failed your final English exam, which, if the system works right, should mean that you don't exhibit the necessary qualities to excel in an English landscape. Fast forward 4 years later, and you wrote as a dyslexic person, friendly reminder, dyslexic person, disability that inhibits reading, sometimes writing, grammar, and spelling. You wrote a 270 plus page book filled with wisdom and humor. And I mean, the grammar was great. I'm kind of a lover of grammar. It was beautiful. So, man, I just wanted an ADHD tangent there for 5 seconds. But the point here is, if that examination structure was correct, you shouldn't have been able to accomplish what you did. So the fact that you were able to write this book, I think just shows how flawed the system is. And it's just a great way to move into not how to change yourselves for the system, but how to recognize the flaws of the system and to adjust accordingly.
And it raises the question of, how do we, and when I say we, I mean the neurodiverse community, how do we survive and thrive in a flawed system? Obviously, our work collectively at the highest level is to agitate, to change that system. And I've dedicated 25 years plus doing my part to try to evolve our notions of normal and the systems that enforce it. But look, I want to be real, because I think this is the real that you're probably facing. And it's the real that people are facing every day, which is, while we work to change it, how do we thrive within it? Not as the world should be, but as it is. And the story that you articulated around that sort of inflection point in my life, where I was doing everything I could within the confines of the system to be successful and show what I'm good at. I was faxing my papers to my mom. I was staying up late. I was doing 10 times the amount of work that other people did. And I had created a path in which my passion for stories and literature could be seen. And that was all shut down by a standardized approach to assessment, where I show up and I have no accommodations. And that final test negates everything that I had done. And I call that an inflection point because it was in college. It was at my first university before I transferred to Brown. And what happened in that moment was a stark realization that the system was screwed and not me. And I remember sitting there being like, how is this fair? I have a A when I'm allowed to do things my way. And now this practice is going to negate all of that. And not only was it an inflection point for me to realize that it wasn't me, it was the environment around me. More importantly, and I think this is relevant to anyone listening who is navigating the world as it is, not as it should be, my reaction to that was to get pissed off. And that's the first time that was my reaction. Leading up to that, because look, there were numerous different expressions of the same ableism throughout my life. And leading up to that, I would internalize it. It's my problem. I'm dumb. I didn't work hard enough. To me, I'm the problem. And that moment where I said, no, look, this is just wrong. I stopped being ashamed and internalizing my anger, which led to a lot of self-destructive behavior in my late teens, early 20s. And I started to get pissed off at the flawed system. And I started to use that anger not to consume me, but to fuel me. A good friend of mine, activist, poet named Roberto Rivera, who has comparable journeys to ours, he likes to say that he used his pain as propane. And that was and is a critical inflection point for all of us. Because when we're ashamed and the anger's turned towards ourselves, it consumes us. But when we recognize this is an injustice, and I use that term intentionally, then we can be angry, not at ourselves, but at the injustice. And then we can set forth to say, you know what? I'm going to prove those people wrong. That's a powerful moment in somebody's life to say, I'm going to prove them, whoever them is. It was my dad at times. It was a teacher named Mrs. C in there. It was that person who gave me that test. I'm going to prove that person wrong. And that's a moment of healing. It's also a moment of profound transformation. And it is an important step for anyone, you, myself, anyone looking to navigate a world built for the normal. That's something we all have to collectively do.
It is something we all have to collectively do. That's why interviews like this I feel are so important, because you and I are members of a larger collective of neurodiverse people who are navigating this unjust system as it is, not how we want it to be. So our conversations and our example hopefully will help shed a light on anyone else who's experiencing this. And I guess this is where now I come to the me of the interview, where I am going off to UCLA, to college, to a system that is in many ways unjust, and in a lot of ways expects me to conform to their standards, whether it be academically or, especially in my case as an autistic person, socially. And I and many others could really use some of your wisdom as a neurodiverse person who not only went to college, but went to Brown, which maybe not Harvard, but it's an Ivy League. It's a great, I'm just messing with you. You went to an Ivy League school. You went to an amazing school and you did this. So with that said, I kind of have 3 questions around how you navigated your neurodiversity. And those are questions that I saw you address in many ways in your book as well, which are how to overcome the system's limitations academically, how to navigate how the system impacts you socially, how the visibility of your difference impacted you. And perhaps the meatiest of this, the meatiest, which you've already touched on beautifully earlier, is the intrapersonal element. How does being neurodiverse in this unjust system chip away at your sense of self and your self-confidence? And how do you recover from that after all the societal messaging? I want to start with the academic piece. If you could shed a little light on what helped you get through the academic injustices of college.
Yeah, you're right. Harvard's not Brown.
I was joking. I feel bad already.
You don't need to feel bad at all. The good thing you should know about most people, not all people who went to Brown, is they don't really care about any of this stuff. And for me, Brown is an expression of my first piece of advice around thriving academically as somebody with neurodiversity. And that first piece of advice is know yourself and match your learning environment based on that self-knowledge. And I say that Brown is a good example of that. I'm not somebody who does well when I'm told what to do or what I have to do. I'm not extrinsically motivated, I'm intrinsically motivated. So if you look at my previous university before transferring to Brown, I took 80-90% of my classes around English literature because that's what I care about. If I had to take a class I didn't care about, I don't do well. And so for me, that knowledge, that really, really clear knowledge led me to seek out, when I was making a profound academic change, environments that were aligned with that self-knowledge. And what that means in my journey, and the reason I say Brown's a good example, is I needed to go to a place with no core requirements because I'm not going to do well when I'm told what to take. And that was a very small list, obviously. Brown being the archetype of that, meaning they really led the country with the open curriculum. But there were other schools like that. So for me, selecting the right environment was key. I did not want to go to, nor did I apply to Columbia or Yale or any of those places because it wasn't a good fit. Now, putting open curriculum and Brown aside, that's something that we all should be asking ourselves constantly. What's the right fit for what I know about myself? And you can ask that question at a high level as it pertains to an institution that you're trying to select. You can ask it on a smaller level of a particular class or a particular major. And then you can ask it post higher education about a particular job or relationship. That's a foundational requirement to thriving being neurodiverse. You've been told who you should be by so many different systems and messengers. What you need to do, I'm speaking in the global you, is find out not who you should be, but who you are, and take real, honest stock of that. Know what you're good at, know what you're not, know what you need, and know what you really care about deeply. Now, look, I'm not naive. That's an iterative process, right? You are so far ahead of me in every way when I was 19 years old. This was something that I stumbled in the dark on, not knowing myself, trying to be somebody else that I shouldn't be. And I wish I would have started that metacognitive, thinking about my own thinking, my own self process earlier, because it fundamentally made all the difference when it came to navigating academic environments. It's the foundation to the other things that I'm happy to reflect on that support the academic success. But everything else, I would say, starts from that.
Yeah, metacognition is a word that I'm very familiar with because you were right. That's something that's really guided a lot of the learning I had. In fact, a lot of my college essays were pretty much structured around the idea of knowing who I am as an advocate for neurodiversity, talking about how I started to break out of feeling insecure about who I am and started owning my own education, getting accommodations for basketball and academics, stuff like that. You're absolutely right. It is the foundation. But for the purposes of everyone else not stumbling in the dark, like you say you did, and like, to be honest, I did, I'd love for you to give a little bit of scaffolding for what developing that kind of metacognition looks like. I mean, you identified, I like English literature, I self-motivate, I don't do well when others tell me what to do and what to learn. And that seemed to be the guidepost for how you succeed in education. So what led you to identifying those things in yourself, and how can others apply that thinking?
Well, first, the deeply flawed set of processes that lead to neurodiversities being identified also have really important knowledge and information for us in it. What I'm referring to is the sort of diagnostic process that is historically, I think this is shifting a little bit, but not enough, but historically is a sort of deficit pathology driven model, right? Diagnosis by definition is a disease based term, right? We diagnose a medical term, but it doesn't have to be. We're diagnosing maybe a problem. Again, that's a little bit outside of the medical model, but it's still a deficit model. So I like to, and I'm not alone in this, reframe that process from diagnosis to assessment. And when we look at the processes and documents that most of us who are neurodiverse go through in some form, the assessment has some really good information about our brains in it. And I encourage all of us to think about that assessment as a foundational tool for self-knowledge. Obviously, it leans a little heavy into the deficit side of things, but more and more practitioners are doing strength-based assessment that celebrates the strength of autism, the strengths of ADD, the strengths of anxiety. Now, it's not naive about the challenges that come with those neurodiversities, and it documents those too. So together, let's dive into those reports. If we're a practitioner listening right now, let's use this as a moment to not talk about the problem necessarily or only, but let's use these assessments as a way to build metacognition and self-knowledge, because it is the foundation of self-actualization and thriving. Now, the other thing I'll say about this is a lot of the metacognition is done symbiotically with somebody else who reflects back to you what they see. I never thought about myself as somebody who was good at telling stories until a third grade teacher said, "Hey, Jonathan, you could be a writer." And I was 9 and I looked at this guy and I said, "A writer? Are you out of your goddamn mind? I can't spell, man. What the hell are you talking about, dude?" And he looks back at me and he says, "Jonathan, screw spelling. I see something in you." And so this is a practical piece of advice. Seek out people in your life who can reflect back to you the good things they see in you to help build that sense of self-knowledge. And it's also a call for action for all of us to be humans that find the good and try to share that with the people in our lives. Like your brother, I have 3 kids. I try to hold myself accountable to that. I have friends, kids that I try to be that voice of, "Hey, I saw this in you. This is really great. I hope you know that." So that's a concrete way to start thinking about metacognitive stuff. Last thing I'll say, because the deficit model piece is so entrenched, especially in the diagnostic processes that we all go through, there's a whole bunch of tools out there that one can use to get more information about their signature strengths, whether that be the Gallup organization strength finding tool, whether that be a platform that I've been a part of called Thrively, which is all about surfacing character strengths, signature strengths, learning strengths. All of those are free of cost. And so I think those are really important tools for us to mobilize in our own personal journey as learners, as students, but then also for us to try to mobilize more broadly in the lives of our friends, our loved ones, and ultimately in our school systems, so that we can put center this notion of know yourself, not who you should be, but who you are, as a really profound way to resist normal, because normal comes in and says, this is who you should be. And also as a really practical, pragmatic way to equip young people and all people who are neurodiverse with the information about themselves that they can then leverage to build a life that's fulfilling and a life that's successful.
The way you talked about using tools to help compensate for difficulties neurodiverse people have in accessing education, it actually reminded me a lot of what my dad would say. He's in the construction, math, business world, and he sees them as hacks. He asks me, what are your hacks to get through a problem? So, for example, I identify as a writer. That's something that I identify as a strength of mine. But what I do is I'd struggle to actually sit down and be able to type without getting anxious and overwhelmed. So what I did was, instead of just banging my head against a wall, which granted, there was a lot of that involved in the process, I eventually used a speech-to-text app called Otter, which is actually free for use up to a certain amount of minutes of audio, where I essentially spoke out my college application essays and edited from there. And without that tool, that use of that tool, I wouldn't have been able to really present myself in the way I wanted to, I probably would not be at UCLA to this day. As someone with an autistic hyperfocus and superheroes, I'd almost recommend be like Batman. Batman is a hero who has no superpowers to speak of, yet fights Superman and Wonder Woman and Green Lantern on equal footing because he uses tools and gadgets to help him fight. So I implore any listeners out there, if you're still struggling to overcome the deficits of the education system, be your own Batman and use the tools around you. With that said, I'm going to pivot to the next question, which is
you also got the Batman's got the coolest suit. So, let's let's not sell Batman short. I couldn't agree more with how eloquently and clearly you said that. Look, I dictated large portions of normal sucks through multiple varying different speech to text software.
Mhm.
And the thing that I would really encourage all of us is that these are not hacks, to use your word, to overcome your limitations. These are hacks to overcome the limitations of the system around you. And that's where this sort of notion of getting pissed comes from. Because when you're angry at yourself, and this happens a lot, young people don't use the accommodations or hacks that are offered to them. When I went to college before Brown, I didn't go to the Office of Disability Support Services because I didn't want to be the kid who was the SPED kid again, and I didn't want to be identified as needing all this extra help because I was still in that self-shame opposed to that propane stage, to quote my good friend. So the moment I got into that propane stage of like, nah, I'm pissed. I have a right to be pissed. You have a right to be pissed. It's not cool that anybody is told that they're defective or deficient as a human being, because any human, period, but certainly because of a neurodiversity or atypical body. So get pissed off. And then these things become hacks, not to fix oneself, but to overcome the barriers within one's environment. And that is the fundamental do different that I see successful, thriving, neurodiverse human beings do. They shamelessly, relentlessly use every tool on that Batman tool belt that's at their disposal. And that makes all the difference.
Right. I appreciate you calling out my own language. That's right. I did say using these tools to overcome our limitations rather than overcoming the limitations of the education system. And I think that betrays a real problem where even me, who's been educated on neurodiversity and what that means and has made a conscious effort to tune into that, I still haven't quite gotten the language out of my head that we are deficient. So I appreciate you calling that out. Also, Batman, great character. Watch The Dark Knight if you haven't already. It's on HBO Max. It's excellent. Anyways, to get back to the interview.
We're not going to just talk about Batman the rest of the time, dude.
I'm as disappointed as you are. Truly. That'll come in part 3.
Good. And then we'll throw some Marvel in the mix, or some X-Men, which is the cinematic celebration of the value of mutation to the human race. So to be continued.
Oh my gosh. X-Men has so many allegories to diversity. Part 3 is coming, you guys. But anyways, I loved how you talked about going into, if I'm correct, LMU, which was your first college. You didn't apply for disability aid because, and I'm going to quote you here, you didn't want to be identified as the SPED kid. And identified there has a key implication of the socialization of disabilities. You didn't want others to see you in a certain manner. And that goes into my second question about the social disability. I want to know how, from your childhood onwards, how the visibility of your neurodifferences affected you. And from there, how you were able to overcome that socialization to an extent, if you did.
Well, I think at first, the social disability was visual, meaning I was in the hallway. Okay, everyone can see that. The reading out loud circles up. And when it's right before it's my turn, I raise my hand to go to the bathroom. The hall of great spellers, everyone's got the gold stars and I have none. There was, and still is, very clear practices that identify and target groups of human beings as being less than in what is a system that had its origin to be the ranking and hierarchy of human beings. Who's going to run the factory? Who's going to manage the factory? Who's going to own the factory? Who's going to manage it? Who's going to clean it? And, that was the historical origins of public education in America and our educational model writ large, with some aberrant exceptions here or there. Now, what happened later, though, and I think in some ways is even more nefarious, is the social stigma led to me hiding or trying to pass as normal for the vast majority of my adolescence and well into my early 20s, late teens. And that's one of the paradoxes, and I think one of the very unique challenges of neurodiversity, that you can, unlike having a clearly visible atypical brain or body, you can pass or try to pass. And look, I use that word really intentionally with full awareness of its reference to the LGBTQ plus experience. And I think there's real merit in making that intersection and drawing that connection between our two communities. And so, as I learned from, at the very least, the LGBTQ struggle for justice, a big part of that was about overcoming internally the social pressure to pass as normal. And that took a great toll, trying to pass as normal, because one is hiding from others, of course, but also from yourself, something that's authentically true about you. And that always comes at a pretty great cost. And that was broken by the blatant injustice, to me at least, of that experience at LMU. But ultimately, it was broken when I started to see people who were courageous and come into relationship with people who were courageously out and proud. Again, using that word with all due deference and respect to the LGBTQ plus movement, out and proud as neurodiverse. And seeing people out there who were bold in that way gave me courage, gave me encouragement to live that way myself.
I have a lot of feelings about what you shared. I feel a sense of being seen in terms of the struggles of passing, or as I call with my autism, masking as neurotypical. I feel acutely what you were talking about, the visibility of it. For you, it was going to a different classroom. For your reading differences and dyslexia. For me, that was when I was younger. I had an 8 in my classroom, which, as I got older, started to identify me as different, and the implication being lesser. But along with that, I felt a little bit of guilt. And if it's okay, I'm going to share a little bit about my story now, which will pivot into the third question about intrapersonally dealing with neurodiversity. Because you talked about how it was so important for you to see those around you being out and proud, and that helped you overcome the socialization of neurodiversity for yourself. And I am probably the biggest offender of not being out and proud. So for a little bit of context, I was diagnosed with autism at 18 months, and not Asperger's, autism, as in I couldn't speak until I was 2. I didn't respond to my own name. I couldn't follow points. But I didn't find out until I was 13 because of the extent to the intervention I received from my family, which included strict gut diet and dietary supplements. Gut health is a frontier of neurodiverse treatment. Whether that's ethical or not is a whole nother question, but that's the route my family took. I had lots of ABA therapy, another controversial treatment for autism, but one that did give me the skills to be able to pass if I chose. But I reached a point where, when I was in adolescence, I really felt acutely the social pressures to be normal and to fit in, to the point where I was spending my time at night studying comedy routines and late night shows to understand intonation and sarcasm, what that all meant, because I didn't get it intuitively. I had to learn it from scratch. And throughout high school, I was absolutely horrible at recognizing what my needs were and what my strengths were. I participated in varsity sports, which was an amazing experience, but was really not mental illness and neurodiversity friendly. I was constantly being over socialized and overstimulated. The anxiety surrounding the social interactions with my teammates and what my role on the team was never properly addressed. It took incredible amounts of energy. I constantly pushed myself to socialize on a neurotypical level with my peers. I do full eye contact and intonation. I dressed like they did. I talked like they did. I fully passed as a neurotypical individual. And at this point, going into college, that hasn't gotten much better. I'm still presenting myself to the world as if I am completely neurotypical, completely normal. And I'm about to go into this space that is highly energy intensive. And I fear that if I don't figure out how to be out and proud, not just for others, but for myself and my own needs, I might, to an extent, crash and burn. So, my question to you is on that intrapersonal level, the way you see yourself and your lack of normalcy. First of all, how did it chip at your sense of self, if it did? And what I really want to know is how you crossed over that threshold to not swimming against the current.
Well, I mean, first, I just want to commend you for deep self knowledge and a real deep understanding of the way that social processes impinge on the self concept and self development of yourself, obviously, but all of us. And I want to encourage you, and this is above and beyond you, because I know that your really eloquent and passionate story of masking passing is a story that a lot of other people share, which is, have some self-love for yourself and resist the urge to criticize oneself, because the forces bearing down from Instagram, where everyone's performing some fake notion of normal and perfect, to the social structure of sports and school and beyond, it is a tsunami that is hard to resist and
Absolutely.
overwhelms most of our sort of sense of self. So it's also something that I just resonate deeply with. I mean, you and I have a lot of areas of intersection. I was an athlete. That was my compensatory identity. I was constantly trying to mimic or mock what that group and other groups did, how they talked, how they dressed, how they looked, to not be the stupid, crazy, lazy kid in the hallway. The costs of that were clear. I had a plan for suicide when I was 12. I struggled with pretty excessive binge drinking, not persistent drinking, but dangerous levels of binge drinking in my late teens and early 20s. And it was a hole that no matter what I did, could I figure out how to fill. So that raises the question that you ask, which is what flipped the switch,
Yeah.
And what flipped the switch was a very specific experience. I've alluded in our interview on a number of different occasions that I transferred from LMU to Brown. I went to LMU on soccer scholarship, and I really only saw that as my main sense of self. But on the other side, sort of the angel on the other shoulder was interested in literature, working hard, too hard at many times to try to do school the way it's supposed to be done. And then that moment of advocacy because I got pissed off. And so that led me to thinking about what's next for me. And I decided to transfer to Brown. And when I transferred to Brown, on the first day, there was a orientation for transfer students. And we had an icebreaker. And the icebreaker was you'd go around the circle and you would share where you transferred from and what you did the summer before. So look, this is Brown. So it's all this sort of let the brag fest begin. It's like I transferred from Yale, and I worked at the National Institute of Health. I transferred from Harvard, and I'm on a short list for a Nobel Prize. It's just like,
As
and
one
here
does.
as one does, of course. And so here I am, being like, I didn't learn to read till I was 12, and I waited tables summer before coming to Brown, and I'm out of here. I can't pass here. I'm not going to make it. It's over. And I remember literally making a plan to like call my mom and say, hey, you got to come pick me up. This ain't going to work. And then the next person went, and he had purple hair, and he had bicycle chains around his wrists like they were bracelets. And he said, my name is David Cole, and I transferred from Landmark College, which is a 2-year college for people with learning and attentional disabilities. And I worked construction last summer. I'm like, that's my boy right there, And I went right up to him and I said, I've never heard anything like that before. And I told him, first person outside of a teacher or my parents that I told about my dyslexia. And I said, look, I'm dyslexic. I have a hard time with reading and writing. And I'm really scared to be here. That's what I said to him. And he looked right at me and he said, the dyslexic brain kicks ass.
Oh, I need to show my brother this part of the interview. He's gonna.
And Dave Cole became the co-author of Running Outside the Lines. Dave Cole became the co-founder of a mentoring program that Dave and I and others started at Brown called Eye to Eye. And he's the one that helped me move from shame to pride. It took time. It's one step forward, a couple steps back, and then we keep going. But that was a foundational moment of change for me. And so the lesson from that, outside of my own journey, the lesson for us, I think, is find your crew. And what I found, and it took me a long time to get there, was my crew wasn't just the neurodiverse. My crew was the LGBTQ plus world that had been pathologized. I mean, we forget that homosexuality in America was a diagnosed mental disorder until the early 70s in the DSM. We forget that eugenics was a movement that was used to dehumanize enslaved African Americans. And when they tried to run away from being slaves, they were diagnosed with slave running away sickness. No shit, that's an actual thing. So my point is, find your crew, find pockets of people where they move from shame to pride. And that transformation from shame to pride is a fundamental foundation of any social justice movement, right? Any social justice movement, whether it be feminism, whether it be LGBTQ plus rights and disability rights, everything in between. Find a crew that helps you make that transition. And so that's very abstract advice, but it's also very practical advice. It's to seek out those people who are prideful of these differences and to listen and learn from them and to find courage and inspiration with them. And that's also a part of the development of self-knowledge. And so there's a symbiotic relationship between engaging in a community that is pride-based and learning about yourself. And then the last thing I'll say is, for me, the healing, the ultimate healing, and from that place of being the plan for suicide when I was 12, it came from not just being engaged in a community, but then contributing to my community. And I mentioned we created this thing called Eye to Eye that took college students with learning neurodiversities and matched them with kids. And the most amazing thing about Eye to Eye is the people who benefited the most were not the neurodiverse children being mentored, but the people doing the mentoring, because they found a way to contribute, to give, which is in and of itself a fundamental rejection of the deficit model, because the deficit model says we have nothing to give. We're supposed to receive services and be fixed. The pride model says, no, we have something to give. And we're coming from a place of strength and community and pride in who we are. And so find your crew and then do something to make our community better and ultimately the world better. And that's a path to a good life.
I can't think of a better way to close out this section of the interview in this lesson with a quote from my main man, Spider-Man: "With great power, there must also come great responsibility." And what's resonating with me is that allusion to your friend David Cole. He used his neurodiversity and his apparent gift for authenticity and bravery and pride to give to you what I'm hearing is a priceless gift of coming into your own. And I need to do a better job of giving, because what I'm realizing is all the self-protective things I've done to avoid at all costs being identified as different was selfish and arguably could have held my community back. So that's something I'm really going to take to heart. So I'm grateful for you for giving me that. And to anyone else listening, if you do have the opportunity to give of yourself, to move from shame to pride for yourself and give that gift to others, if you can, you've got to. You've got to give. And then if we all give, not to go too far into kumbaya, but if we all give and it helps us all, then that's how we move the community forward. So with great power comes great responsibility. I'm so grateful David Cole used his power responsibly and gave back to you so you could give back to me and the community, and I could hopefully call upon others and help give back myself. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Obviously, I'm not quite there yet, but thank you for that gift. Really appreciate it.
Well, I think we should sing some Kumbaya together, honestly, because I'm down.
All right, let's link up hands.
Because I'm down with it, and you couldn't have said it better. Let's all stop faking normal, because normal is only given power when we all collectively believe in its illusion.
I guess a quick aside before we head into the outro, and I do want to be respectful of your time. For those of us who aren't neurodiverse, who are neurotypical, and whose brains may exhibit more signs of normalcy than others, and I'm thinking very specifically to the kinds of people who I would mask around in fear of not being seen as part of their group. What do you think they could take away from this conversation in terms of the idea of normalcy and coming into your own self? What do you think that the people who are quote unquote normal could take away from your philosophy?
I think all of us, should hold center to our art of living the universal human truth that the only normal people are people you don't know very well. Difference is what constitutes our humanity. And it's the great hope I have for the neurodiversity and disability rights movement, which I think of as a movement with different cognitive and physical experiences united under it. We as a movement are really fighting for every human being's right to be different. And we are demanding that we have systems of learning, of work, and systems of community that don't just work for some people, but ultimately work for all people.
Right. It all comes back to, and if anyone's at all active in neurodiversity circles, you'll probably hear this a lot, but universal design. The idea that the changes we're trying to see in society for the neurodiverse community really has a universal application and can help everyone. And that's such a brilliant way to tie this all together, that normal sucks for everyone. It's not just for neurodiverse people. I have so many close friends who would otherwise be identified as normal, but I've quote unquote normal, because there is no normal, that I've seen still struggle with societal expectations. And if we could hold these lessons as something that everyone could take on, I know that if I was more open with myself, I could help those around me. And if everyone in the world was more open with themselves and exhibited less signs of striving to be normal, I know from my experiences, and yours as well, one person who lives that authentic truth, it has a ripple effect.
Kumbaya again. I'm singing it in the background. If we all stop faking normal, the world would be a better place for all of us.
There we go. All right. So, Mom, I think now's a good time to pivot back to you for the conclusionary portion of this interview.
Good save right there. I do that all the time. I'm about to totally screw a word up, and I just kind of pull it out of my ass, and it's all good. I love it.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel acknowledged. Kumbaya. Let's all sing, everybody.
I think you made a new word, Ryan.
Conclusionary.
So, of course, I've been just listening, lots of smiling, lots of tears at this really beautiful conversation that was so illuminating in so many ways for me as a parent, for me as a neurodiverse person, as your mom, Ryan, getting ready to send you off to college. I'm just immensely grateful for all the wisdom and insight that you both shared with one another. Before we move to final acknowledgments, I am wondering, Jonathan, if, as you know, Ryan is getting ready to, in less than 2 weeks, he'll move into his dorm and really start this independent experiment of being a college freshman. Do you have a particular challenge or invitation that you'd like to offer him that he can be accountable to you in the best way to support him in his transition?
My challenge to Ryan, but also to all of us as we navigate building an authentic self in face of the relentless pressure to be normal. My challenge is to not ask yourself, are you going to be successful or are you successful? My challenge is to hold yourself accountable to be successful in the right way. I definitely tried to fill that hole for a long time, certainly when I was in college, that hole of stupid, crazy, lazy, different is deficient, by trying to accumulate all accolades and all the things that I was told that I could never have, shouldn't be, couldn't be. And it's a dead end,
It's
it
a dead
is.
end.
It's a dead end. What really filled that hole wasn't the aping or the appropriation of the normal definition of success. What filled that hole was community, purpose, pride, passion, not a 4.0, not a fancy
Normal
award.
sucks.
Normal sucks, and it sucks for everyone. Everyone.
I'm excited to see how I can apply the challenge in college. I from as young as I can remember, I've always wanted to be, there's really no other way to put it. I've wanted to be normal. I looked up to the people who were going to parties, playing sports, experiencing social success in this unjust, imperfect landscape. And I think the point that will get me out of the dead end is to aspire to be like David Cole, to be someone who, through authenticity and living outside the lines and saying something like the dyslexic brain is sick, which is a fire quote, and I could put on you got put on a t-shirt and sell it online. But I think that's just such a better goal for me to have, and for anyone else to have, is aspire to be like that guy. And what we were saying at the end, which really hit me, the only people who are normal are the people you've never met yet. No one is normal. They only seem like they are. Case in point, there's so many people who probably think I'm normal. I'm literally autistic. I'm not normal, but that perception exists. And just for everyone, if you think someone else is acting normally, there's a fair chance they're only doing that to protect themselves from you, and you're doing it to protect yourselves from them. And it's this whole never-ending cycle of trying to be safe over making real connections. I'd say just remember that normal sucks. Be like David Cole. I think that's where I'm at.
So, Ryan, I think you moved us into final acknowledgments. Unless there's anything else you want to add that is the biggest takeaway for you.
This is going to be a little redundant, but I want to be like David Cole. I want to use my gifts, whatever capacities I have, to be metacognitive and introspect, to be my authentic self, and to give to my community. Hopefully, I can impact others in the way that he did for you. And it has such a large impact. He was able to springboard you into writing, learning outside the lines, and normal sucks, and doing all of this advocacy. If we all follow that example, it could awaken so many neurodiverse minds that had their eyes opened yet.
Thank you, Ryan. Jonathan, what are your closing thoughts or your biggest takeaways from this conversation? I know you said this is the first time you've had a conversation like this with a neurodiverse student on his way to college.
Between my 3 books, I've been interviewed by NPR, USA Today, NBC, and this is hands down not just the most professional interview that I've been a part of, which it is and was. It's the most personally transformative one. I'm really so grateful for this opportunity, Ryan. But more importantly, I am grateful and hopeful because you're in the world out there being a catalyst for community, a catalyst for pride, a catalyst for change. Because look, I'm an old dusty dude nowadays, You were right. I definitely was sending stuff on a typewriter to my mom, I think that's how old that's how old it goes back. And I've left this grateful and hopeful about our collective future because of you and because of a generation like you. So thank you for that.
I'm humbled. It's probably normally I'd be hesitant to accept something like this, but you said in the beginning to step into being a role model. So I will take it and I will say thank you. Thank you for the gift of this interview. Thank you for the books, for introducing normal sucks into my vernacular so I can tell other people and watch them kind of light up with identification. And man, I can't wait in 4 years to circle back and tell you what I've done because that idea of being able to overcome that social programming through giving back as such a FU to the idea that we are receivers and not, we are takers and not givers, that aligns with so much of what I'm hoping to do. And I can't wait for our generation to finish the work you started.
In the way of final acknowledgments from me, I'm really in awe at the spirit of generosity from both of you. I am reminded about the incredible power of telling our stories and being authentic and open. And this is probably one of the first interviews where I spent the majority of the time listening. And so I also want to acknowledge the incredible power of listening. I've learned so much from both of you. And I know that this episode and this conversation is going to have ongoing ripple effects for so many of us who all want to figure out the ways in which we're smart, who we really are, the environments that we can thrive in, and how we can make an impact. So thank you. Thank you.
First of all, Mom, I want to say again, thank you for being such a catalyst in introducing me to people like Jonathan, people like Julie Lithcott-Haynes, who I mentioned before, who were able to give me insights heading into new chapters of my life. I also, before I pass it off to Jonathan to close out, I want to give a huge shout out to my longtime therapist, Callum Eastwood. Jonathan talked earlier about the power of having someone else to help identify really who you are, what your strengths are, and how you can apply them in developing that metacognitive eye. And the metacognition I've developed didn't occur in a vacuum. It was years of conversation, pushback, challenging norms, thoughts, and emotions from this wonderful man who that's given me the power to voice my experiences in a way that could be of service to others. And I encourage anyone who doesn't have someone they can talk to help them activate that metacognition, find them. Jonathan was on a first name basis with the janitor and receptionist. It can be anyone, but just find that person.
Last word to you, Jonathan.
Look, I've been at this long enough to know when to drop the mic. And I'm going to respectfully let Ryan have the last word, because the baton is being passed and it comes with a lot of responsibility, Ryan. And it comes with responsibility to not only yourself and your own well-being, but to our collective well-being. And it's in good hands. And the community is going to make, I think, the most profound contribution to our society in the next decade. And the world's going to be a better place, not for some, but for all because of it.
Not for some, but for all. I think that's the perfect place to close out.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about how to join the Mother's Quest community, visit mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and help us to spread the word. I want to end with some words to help light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gifts. Until next time.